So today I just wanted to look at a quick question, and a very basic question. How is the gospel relevant to our friendships? So in order to start to dive into this question, we first need to look at what is the gospel. And I'm not talking about the Sunday school version, Jesus came and died to save us from our sins. I want to actually look at what that really means. So I want us to explore the gospel concepts in some very everyday language. As my one teacher puts it, human beings need saving because we have this ability to mess everything up. Have you ever tried to do something and it's just not gone according to plan? We've all been there. We have this idea of what we want something to look like in our head, and during the execution process, it just does not turn out that way. Or maybe sometimes it did, and then that plan completely backfires. Human beings have this ability to make a mess of any and every situation. Every person has flaws. We're imperfect. It's part of the human condition. But how did it get that way? So most of us have heard some version of the story of Adam and Eve and the apple in the Garden of Eden, or fruit, or we don't really know if it was an apple, but fruit. As a species, we chose disobedience towards God. But what does that mean? We chose to stray from the path of our best interests. So it's as though we had the greatest internship of all times. We might not have been making any money at the time, but we had this solid co-op position through our school, working in a great field that we wanted to be in. We were all set to make all kinds of connections to get that solid career start that we needed. We would have all the experience needed for that scholarship and free money and get a ride to post-secondary education. But instead, we chose to drop out and take a minimum wage job because it had a paycheck now, instead of waiting for the rewards to come. It's that instant gratification piece. Something looked better in the short term, so we went for that instead. And that is how brokenness entered the world. But of course, a loving God would never leave us alone in that situation and in that brokenness. So God, his very self, came in the person of Jesus, God the Son, or Christ. He is the only human being who was perfect. And he was perfect because he was 100% God. Now this kind of trips some people up. How can someone be 100% God and 100% man? I like to use the analogy that I'm 100% Canadian, but I'm also 100% Christian. The Bible says that as Christians we have citizenship in heaven. Being Canadian doesn't discredit my citizenship in heaven in any way. But being Christian doesn't mean that I don't have to live by Canadian law. So I'm under both the reign of the Canadian government and the reign of Christ, 100% and 100%. We as a species chose to murder Jesus, thus murdering God. Now Jesus knew that when he came to the world that this was going to happen. God accommodated for our ability to mess up this situation, and he incorporated it into his plan, and made a plan based on this. He knew if Jesus was sent to earth, he would die, and he planned for that. When we mess things up, God redeems situations and creates something even better out of them than what could have existed before. So when we messed up and left that path of our best interest, and when we messed up again and rejected Jesus, this created a situation where Jesus could rise from the dead, conquering the effects of brokenness and overcoming our ability to mess things up. When we say that Jesus defeated our sin, what we mean is that God fixes and mends our mess on our behalf, and that no matter how much of a mess or brokenness we cause, he continues to create a mended version of that and undoes the mess. He creates a way back to that path of best interest. We can kind of view this as Jesus throwing ropes from that path of best interest to guide us back there. Now, there's a lot of debate around what this rope throwing looks like, and how that comes about. So I'm going to get into some analogies here that touch on some deep theological constructs, but you guys are a pretty smart group, and I'm sure that you can understand them, so I'll try and make it as basic as possible. So when we talk about these ropes, there's kind of a spectrum of where people fall. It's not really a dichotomy of you view it this way or the other way. It's kind of a sliding scale, and different groups fall to different places on that scale. So what I'm going to do is kind of look at the 3 points of that scale. The one side, kind of where that approximately the middle ground would be, and then the other side. And then what I'm going to do is talk about where our particular church would fall within that category. So the first one is what I like to refer to as Cowboy Jesus. So in this one, Jesus comes in complete with cowboy boots, tipped hat, and the rope acts as his little lasso. So Jesus comes riding in, spots a person, whips out the lasso, and rodeo in style flicks it at that person, and they are caught in that rope, whether or not they want to be. Then he reels them in. So this is kind of a Calvinist view with predestination in mind. So in this view, the person has no control over it. Jesus just ropes them in. Then there's the more middle ground, which is kind of like what I like to consider the rock climbing Jesus. So we started out at the bottom of this mountain, and God said, "This is the best path for you to take." But we human beings looked up at it and we thought, "I don't know, God, that seems kind of steep, and I don't really see a lot of places for me to grip my hands or feet as I go up that." Then we looked to our right and thought, that path looks a little less steep and looks more manageable, and decided to start climbing there. Now, for anyone who knows anything about rock climbing, usually you're tethered together by a rope, and one person acts as the anchor. This is helpful because if one person falls, then they don't go crashing to their death. The other person actually holds them up. So in this view, Jesus wants to be the anchor for us and keeps tossing us different ropes, and we might ignore them, we might eventually grab onto one, and he might pull us over, or we might pull our way up using that rope that he's tossed to us. Then there is more of kind of a view as if we're in a woodland path hiking. So for anyone who goes hiking, there's often rectangular markers, they could be red, white, different colors, that mark out your path. In town, if you've ever been out to Robertson's Cliffs, their paths are marked that way out there. So in this view, Jesus has kind of pre-tossed ropes in different places, and he's left them dangling there, and it's up to human beings to find one and follow it back to the path. So they're more like markers in a wood, and they're already there, pre-planned out, and that's more of an Arminian view. So again, this is kind of a very quick generalization of these views, but and it's more of a sliding scale than firm, you fall in one camp or the other. So where does our particular church fit? Well, First Baptist would probably fit somewhere between the cowboy Jesus and the rock climbing Jesus. So we believe in predestination and that, but we also believe in the human free will. So this would be like as if we're rock climbing and Jesus is kind of tossing us that rope, but maybe he uses that rope kind of lasso style on our wrist, and then we have to grab onto that once it's around our wrist, and he'll pull us in, or we can help pull it as well and do. So in that view, Jesus initiates and is the cause of that rope tossing, but our free will has to respond to it. So when we decide to follow him, he ties that rope around our waist once we get back to the path of best interest. And this moment is what we call salvation. So whether we get there because he roped us in unwillingly, or whether we had a part in accepting that and working with him to get in, that once we're there, he ties that rope around, and that is our moment of salvation. Because we're humans, we can often tend to wander off again. It's very common. Salvation does not keep us from making mistakes. But we cannot lose our salvation. So the difference here is that, thankfully, the rope remains around us even when we wander off for the second, third, fourth, millionth time, because we're humans and we tend to do it a lot. And as soon as we realize that we've gone off, or sometimes even when we don't realize, Jesus can reel us back in again using that rope. So this path of best interest is the path that God the Father dwells on, and Jesus acts as the bridge as getting us back to where that dwelling place is. In essence, the gospel is God's story of restoring relationship between himself and humankind. So if we think back to our initial question, how can this impact our friendships? Our goal as Christians is to be little arrows pointing towards Jesus Christ and the cross. But how do we practically do that, especially in our friendships? We're going to quickly look at two examples from Jesus' life. The first is when he talks with the Samaritan woman at the well. So I'm just going to read the passage and then we'll talk about it. So John chapter 4, verses 1 to 27 reads, Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews did not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water, welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming back here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you are now with is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has come now, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, am he." Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman, but no one asked, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" So this woman was a Samaritan and Jesus was Jewish. These two ethnic groups did not get along. Samaritans were actually seen as below the Jewish nation. Many Jewish people wouldn't even talk to them because they viewed themselves as above them and kind of too good for that. The same goes for women. Men in this day viewed them as lesser than. You often wouldn't talk to a woman in public unless you knew her prior. Jesus not only talks to this woman, but he humbles himself and asks her for help, in this case a drink of water. He asks her to provide for a need in a way that puts her on equal ground with him in that moment. He also offers her something as well. Now, high schools tend to have their own Samaritan groups. Every school is different as to what that out group looks like, and it changes over time. When I started high school, it was the drama kids, and then it turned into the kids in band, and by the end it had shifted to kids in the science and envirothon club. Every school kind of creates that out group, and it's unfortunate really, but it happens. Jesus not only talks to this group, but treats them as equal, despite the fact that others around him, even his own disciples, are surprised by his actions. Jesus treats her with respect, dignity, and loving kindness. So I want you guys to think, and you don't have to share anything out loud, but just kind of think in your mind. Is there a group or friend that you've treated as beneath you that you need to start treating as an equal? And how can you restore these relationships? Or maybe it's not you specifically, but someone at your school that gets treated as below other students. How can you reach out to this person and include them as an equal, even if it may cost you socially to do so? Maybe it's something like really simple. It could be liking a video on their TikTok or a photo on their Instagram that everybody else is making fun of. Maybe it's eating lunch with someone someday. Or maybe it's sitting on the bus next to someone who always sits alone. Now I want to take a quick look at Zacchaeus. Now Zacchaeus is a little bit different. So this passage is actually found in Luke chapter 19 verses 1 to 10. Luke 19 reads, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached that spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, He is gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times that amount. Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. As a tax collector, Zacchaeus is friends with the people in power. So in this day and age, how the government worked was the tax collectors kind of did all their work for them. So he's kind of like the teacher's pet of his day. He's kind of like, the student who reminds a teacher when they forget that there's a quiz. He's got a level of authority, but it's kind of the authority that the average person is not too pleased of him having. This is the kid that waits in the lunch line and reminds the calf lunch lady that she's forgotten to upcharge you for putting chicken on your salad. But you'll notice from this passage that being around Jesus changes Zacchaeus. With that said, Jesus accepted him for who he was, and Jesus never even asked Zacchaeus to change. He hung out with him and got to know him, and his purpose was not to change Zacchaeus, but to build a real friendship with him. We have a way of naturally rubbing off on our friends. Creating relationships with someone can often help them to restore other relationships. It can become this domino reaction. If you notice, Zacchaeus promised to pay back 4 times the amount to anyone he had wronged. When you love people for who they are today, it naturally brings out the best in them. So let's switch now to a little bit of discussion. So I want to know your guys' thoughts as well. So what are some practical ways we can restore relationships with those around us? And what themes stand out to you from these examples in Jesus' life?